And in thinking about this title, we certainly were invoking, talking about the DREAM Act, but we also wanted to talk about the Janus-faced quality of law as well, and the ways in which law has been and continues to be, certainly in the recent state anti-immigration legislation and anti-Latino project as well. And in talking about this topic, I can't help but think about my former student, Marco Feuerbach, who was the student in the first law class I taught in the fall of 1994. He went on to become the Speaker of the House in California, and he wrote the first version of the bill that became the State DREAM Act, which of course became the model that is eventually, hopefully, knock on wood, will get through Congress at the federal level as well. And Marco, we lost Marco way too early in life, and I just want to make sure that we are remembering his presence and his crucial role in bringing us to where we are on this issue today. We have 4 great speakers for you today. I'm not going to give you detailed introductions, but I am going to encourage you to read their bios in the program. Our first speaker will be Victor Viramontes, who is a MALDEF counsel who is at the front lines of fighting the anti-immigrant state legislation, in particular in Arizona, South Carolina, and Alabama. Our second speaker will be Will Bettis, who is a psychologist and professor of education at the Claremont Graduate University. And then our third and fourth speakers will be Carlos Amador and Navy Dominguez Zamoranda, who are founders of the United We Dream movement and just exemplary role models of young Americans who are leading the Dreamer movement, and I think giving us all a lot of inspiration and hope as we continue to fight, yet another civil rights battle in this regard. And with that, I am going to just remind the speakers that I'm a strict timekeeper so that we have time for the audience to ask questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Victor. Thank you.
I think it's safe to say that my portion of the panel has to do with the nightmares part of the title, because what we've seen over the last 2 years is really an unprecedented nightmare for Latinos across the United States. It's unfortunately not unusual to see. Unfortunately, can you hear me now? Yes. Unfortunately, it's not unusual to see anti-immigrant legislation at the state level, at the local level. But what was unique about 2010 and 2011 is that this legislation spread across the country, including into population centers where the Latino population and the immigrant population was minuscule. And so the challenge for us as advocates is that we do not have a voting base, we do not have a population base to make the legislators and the governors who pass these anti-immigrant legislation to suffer from the Latino response and the Latino electorate. And so that, I think, is part of the challenge facing us. And while I am counsel to MALDEF in these cases, I did want to recognize Nicolás Espiritu, who's done a lot of the heavy lifting, particularly in Arizona, to challenge the statute. As I said, these statutes were passed across the country, and particularly in places that you wouldn't expect it, Alabama, South Carolina, where populations are quite small. And I wanted to focus primarily on Arizona's SB 1070 because it was the first, and in many ways, the trailblazer to these anti-immigrant statutes. First, I want to start with the most controversial, most famous piece of SB 1070. That piece that allows local law enforcement, doesn't just allow them, but directs them to investigate the immigration status of anyone that they come across in any kind of lawful stop. And now, before I jump into the separate pieces of Arizona's SB 1070 any further, I want to point out that this is an anti-humanitarian, anti-civil rights statute that's an attack on the entire family. There's no piece of the Latino community that is untouched by this anti-immigrant statute. And you'll see as I take you piece by piece through this statute, you can see it was designed to tear apart families and to tear apart communities. I think legislatures understood that when they passed the statute, and they understood that it would have a tremendous effect on the Latino community, and I think that that's one of the reasons it was passed, and that's why we don't hesitate to call these statutes anti-immigrant and anti-Latino pieces of legislation. Another piece of SB 1070 basically criminalizes being undocumented. Under federal law, being undocumented is not a violation of any criminal statute. In Arizona and the states that copied Arizona, it became criminal. Now, I'm taking you through the statute as it was enacted, and as some of you may know, this is not the law currently today, but I want you to understand the context of how this entire piece of legislation was put in place. So I think the point of this Section 3 is to terrify people to go out into the streets based on their immigration status. If you look like you're an immigrant or you are an immigrant, it makes you subject to criminal prosecution or an investigation with criminal consequence at the very least. Section 5 is a direct attempt to make people starve and to force people to be locked indoors and so that they're afraid to go out into public. So you can see the first piece that I have on the left has to do with preventing people to apply to work or to work at all. And the second piece of this legislation is directly targeted at day laborers. This whole piece was, I think, written with day laborers in mind, but one of them in particular makes it illegal to ask for day labor out on public streets and criminalizes it, whereas you could go out on the public street and do any other sort of speech, whether you're trying to, pitch for a candidate or sell kites. All of that is perfectly legal. But if you ask to do day labor, you could be put in prison. Section 6, we're still in SB 1070, and this provision, another provision that basically forces immigrants into the shadows and was designed to do that, gives local law enforcement more arrest power than actually immigration officers have. And so this, under this provision, elements of federal law that are not criminal in any way, just civil immigration provisions, you would allow to be arrested without any kind of warrant. Now, as SB 1070 was crossing the country, and other states were adopting it and adopting this anti-immigrant ideology, we need to make people starve, we need to make them be afraid to go out in public, we need to make their lives miserable, because that's really the only goal of this law in my mind. There actually was a state who took what Arizona did and made it worse. Now, today we're here to talk about the education of Latinos. And I think that you cannot say that SB 1070 and HB 56, that its effect on education is an unfortunate byproduct, that's something that happened as a result of this anti-immigrant furor, and that students and people trying to go to college were the ones who were affected by accident. And I think you can quite clearly see this by what happened in Alabama, because there's two provisions in Alabama that directly target the educational system and directly undermine student education, and they do it quite blatantly. And so I want to take you through both of those now. First, Section 28. Many of you are probably familiar with Plyler versus Doe. It's the 1984 decision that Maldiff litigated, actually, that allows undocumented immigrants to attend public education free of charge. Now, at the core of that decision is this idea, and really it's the most obvious idea ever, that we're all better off with an educated student group, with educated young people who can care for themselves, who can advocate for themselves, and who are upwardly mobile. Well, Alabama decided that that was a bad idea. And what they did was they made it mandatory for every local school to inquire into the immigration status of the students enrolling there. Not only were they going to look into the immigration status of students, mind you, they also, as part of the law, mandated that local educators look into the immigration status of the parents. So you have administrators, teachers, and the entire educational system working as immigration officers. And they've claimed in open court that this is not going to have a chilling effect, that this is not going to prevent students from going to school, when plainly, that's exactly what it's designed to do. On top of that, they don't have at all any kind of wall that would prevent or keep administrators or teachers from directly interacting with ICE. And so you could actually have students being deported because they're trying to attend school. Now, Section 8 is another provision in Alabama, and there, again, undermining their own self-interest so that they don't have an educated workforce, they don't have people contributing to society to their fullest potential. They're barring undocumented immigrants from attending public colleges at all. So this is what the law was intended to do and how it was constructed. Thankfully, we've been successful in federal court across many of these, and I want you to see now what it was like before and the current situation that we're now in. The things that are blocked. Every criminal provision of SB 1070 has been blocked at this moment. Some of them because of the US government's challenge that you've probably all heard about, the Arizona versus the United States. Some of them by our challenges, which are broader than that brought by the federal government. We've enjoined the day labor portion of SB 1070 and the harboring portion of SB 1070, that portion that would punish someone for taking their undocumented grandmother to the doctor or out to dinner. And so these are the pieces that are all blocked. Particularly, I want to point out to you that Section 28, that would have mandated immigration inquiries in local schools, is also blocked. Unfortunately, there's pieces that got through. And I think you've heard and read that Section 2B, the racial profiling, show me your papers provision, is now being implemented in Arizona and across these other states for which I've shown you. But I do want to emphasize to you that it is a muted form of of Section 2B, as Arizona wanted to do it. They wanted to be able to hold people indefinitely and look at immigration status indefinitely. The Supreme Court told them they couldn't do that. They can only hold individuals for the time that they have to engage in the underlying stop. So if they have you to look at a broken taillight, they can only keep you to look at the broken taillight and no further. As soon as they hold you for any amount of time beyond the time to look into the broken taillight, now they're violating federal law. And unfortunately, Section 8, the provision that allowed, that Alabama wanted to block students from going to college, was also not enjoined. So this is where we are now. These are all preliminary challenges. None of these are final orders. So the things that we've got hung up in court now, we shouldn't make the assumption that they're going to stay hung up, except for the pieces that the Supreme Court has directly spoken on. And these other pieces that have been allowed to go forward, we still have a chance to take those down. Now, part of the challenge of doing some of these civil rights cases is that you can see that we don't always succeed in all of our challenges. And the fact that these laws are getting through is pointing to politicians thinking that they have an opportunity and an ability to score cheap political points by taking on undocumented immigrants and Latinos generally. We've seen this because back when Arizona was first considering SB 1070, you saw that 70% of the electorate was in favor of the statute. There was this huge tidal wind in favor of it, and as the economy sank, anger against immigrants and anger against Latinos rose. And our challenge, I think, is to not only fight these things in court, which we've done with some success, I think, but to continue with this challenge, because the longer I do this work and the longer I engage in this litigation, I've come to understand that the legal battle is only a small piece of the larger war. And I want to emphasize something very significant that's happened since the law was enjoined. And that is that Russell Pierce, the architect of SB 1070 in Arizona, who's been very publicly outed as a white supremacist and has greatly helped our case that the law is tainted by racism and shouldn't be implemented at all, was kicked out of office in a recall election. And by sending that kind of message, that the Latino community will not stand by and allow us to be made into targets and be allowed to be made into victims, I think is a message that we have to send to all of these elected officials nationally. Fighting the lawsuit and making them stand up in court and try to justify the heinous laws they've passed, I think is part of it. But now, as the litigation is going forward, it's going to be going for a while, but as the litigation ends and we keep going at this through other ways, I think that the political battle and the policy battle is what awaits. And I think I'm going to leave those issues to the other panelists, but you can see that we do have some very, very promising things that have happened in favor of education of Latinos and education of immigrants and education of undocumented immigrants. And I want to end on that hopeful note. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon to be part of this distinguished group of individuals who have been doing important and significant work on the issue of undocumented youth and undocumented populations in this country. I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to speak about my work, and particularly how it relates to efforts that are being done nationally, that are being done by MALDEF, to bring to a permanent solution the limbo status of undocumented individuals and families in this country. And in many ways, I feel that the conference for me professionally is sort of the completion of a circle. It was here at this conference in 2009 that I first presented preliminary findings, as a matter of fact, from a research study that we had just concluded, focusing on the academic achievement of undocumented students. And the first book was just coming out that really, in a significant way, examined the academic achievement. So my goal for my comments with you this afternoon is to, one, tell you how far we've come in terms of the research in the past several years on the issue of the academic success and achievement of undocumented youth in schools. And the second goal is to talk about where do we go from here and how do we expand that effort in collaboration with legal scholars and in collaboration with social scientists and other academics who are working on this issue, so that we as a country make policy decisions that are informed by solid data and evidence. This year has been significant for many ways for these efforts. The anniversary of Plyler Doe, and this cover from Time magazine, I think, highlights just how significant all of the work that we've done is in moving us forward to address this issue in a permanent way. And this cover, we are Americans that didn't only feature this issue in what has been euphemistically called the Bible of America. Time magazine is the place where when significant issues are profiled in Time magazine, it means that in mainstream America we've come to recognize as something that is significant and that it has impacted or impacts our lives. But it wasn't just that it was featured in Time magazine in the United States, but that it was featured in all the international editions of Time magazine. So that means that everyone all across the world came to understand that the issue of undocumented youth in the United States is an issue that is of significance And so, to me, as a researcher, as someone who has been working in a very significant way over the last couple of years, it was a moment of validation, and it was a moment of validation absolutely for the amazing work the undocumented youth activists and two of my co-panelists who represent that movement have done. I mean, the tireless effort on their part have brought us here, and I'm certainly in awe of that movement. But there are many things that we continue to address because there's a great need. And this graph here highlights just how much legal status impacts educational attainment. So you can look at that. There's really two graphs that I want you to pay attention to, the top bar and the bottom bar. The top bar shows you sort of the percentage of individuals that are between the ages of 18 and 24. So you can think of these as individuals that are college age, so traditional college age. How many of those are completing high school and are going on to college? And if you look at the percentage of those that don't have legal status in that age group, there's a very high proportion of individuals that don't have, that have less than a high school degree. And there's a very low proportion of those that are in college. That proportion is less than half of their counterparts who do have legal status. So the impact here is very clear on educational attainment. And in our work, the impact has also been clear on educational achievement. So that, the Dreamers profile on the cover of Time magazine are very impressive, and our data certainly suggests that. These are individuals that have been identified as gifted. They are high GPA, they have received numerous academic awards, but there's a small trickle of individuals that are able to accomplish those feats because of the tremendous obstacles that they face. That the ones that do make it, make it by tremendous odds. And as a psychologist, we've examined this from the perspective of resilience, right? That these are in fact highly resilient individuals. These are individuals that have been able to succeed academically despite every obstacle that you can imagine, whether it's socioeconomic challenges, whether it's prejudice and discrimination, whether it's low expectations, whether it's lack of financial resources, whether it's concerns about deportations, whether it's having to manage the mental health symptoms of being undocumented and depression and anxiety, that despite all of that, they accomplish these great feats. And so our work has begun to really sort of highlight how those dynamics play out, but more importantly, about just how over their lifetime, this has been a process for these young adults. So it's not the case that, when they got to high school, all of a sudden they became superstars and they became civically engaged in the way that we've seen, undocumented activists, sort of become leaders at a national level. But one of the things that we found that I think it's important to highlight is that the civic engagement, right, that the contributions that they made to their schools and their communities was something that was a formative part of their lives from as early as elementary school. So we asked, the youth in our study about all the kinds of things that they did, in schools and starting in elementary school. And so that leadership and civic engagement was a formative part. And the argument that I've been making over the past 3 years as I travel the country is that this is a tremendous loss of talent. But on the other hand as well, that these young adults, by overcoming these tremendous obstacles, inspire their US-born counterparts and actually are engaging in ensuring their academic success. So just to sort of give you a tidbit about that, one of the most significant ways in which undocumented young adults are engaged is by tutoring and academic support of students. Many of them do very well in math, they do very well in science, and so guess what they do after school and on the weekends and in summers? They work with academic outreach programs, and they work with mentoring, and they work with tutoring. And the vast majority of those individuals that benefit from their efforts are US-born citizens. These are people that were born in this country that are benefiting from the efforts of individuals that are not really able to fully realize their potential because of the obstacles that they face due to their legal status. And that's something that, for a lot of people, I was giving sort of this kind of presentation in Iowa and in Illinois, and people where they're sort of on the fence about this issue, or they think, well, I'm not quite convinced about this whole DREAM Act business. But the moment they hear something like that, all of a sudden something changes and they think, oh wow, they're doing all these great things. And I think it's that kind of effort, you know, and it has really required me to kind of step outside of sort of my traditional role as an academic, the way that I talk about data, the way that I present my findings. You know, we've done fancy, you know, cluster analyses and regression analyses, but that's not really the way that I think we can effectively shape public policy and shape public opinion. You know, as a scholar, you know, from the very beginning, there was an important goal for me to do. And whereas, you know, we published in academic journals and we have done, you know, the regressions and the cluster analysis and other advanced statistical techniques to understand the data, that we also have to develop a competence, a skill in being able to translate that to a larger audience in ways that are compelling to them as well, in the way that they're compelling to us as social scientists. And so the argument of a talent loss, I found myself becoming more adept as I got to practice that script in explaining to people why we can't be ambivalent about this, or we can't be indifferent about this, and why we have to be engaged. And this is across, you know, all groups, and this is for Latino audiences, this is for white audiences, this is for, you know, multiracial audiences, that this is something that we all, as all of, you know, the presenters earlier today have presented, this is something that affects all of us. It doesn't just affect Latinos, it doesn't just affect the immigrant community or the undocumented community for that matter. A development that I want to highlight that I think is important is the growing amount of support since we started doing this work that ensures that a greater number of undocumented students are able to achieve academically. Professor Olivas talked about during his lunchtime remarks about the number of states that provide in-state tuition and about the number of states that provide tuition assistance, California being one of the most recent members of that elite club. But something that I wanted to share with you that I think, you know, complements those efforts and that oftentimes we don't hear as much about is the growing number of private colleges and universities that have stepped up to that challenge and have joined those efforts to ensure the academic success and the realization of the potential of these highly talented individuals. And that is the role of private colleges and universities. So as you scan this list, this was a list that was probably, you could probably count them on one hand when I first presented the preliminary data at this conference back in 2009. You could probably count on one hand the number of colleges, private college universities that provided full tuition assistance. So, you know, a lot of these colleges, for example, it's $60,000 a year for 4 years. And they're fitting the bill for every one of those undocumented students that are accepted. Most of these, not all of them, but most of these. That's one thing that I want to highlight, and sort of what that commitment means, and what that means about, you know, the success of the immigrant youth movement, for example, that has, you know, in many ways driven this. But also, I want you to note that this is, you know, these are among the most highly selective colleges and universities in this country, I mean, in the world, for that matter. So it's important in that way because these are leaders, and these are people that, these are institutions that have made that commitment. And foundations and corporations and other nonprofit organizations have stepped up to that to support the academic success of undocumented students. So I think that's a tremendous development. That's something that I think it's important for us to celebrate and recognize. And just to realize just that, you know, despite the fact that we might feel like every time we take 2 steps forward, you know, there's 2 steps back, that this is a reminder just of how much we've been able to accomplish in a relatively short amount of time, I think. But I think it's important as we go forward to sort of move beyond the sort of, you know, legal status binary of undocumented and legal status. And the fact is that there are many children and young adults who grow up in mixed status families. And there's virtually no research and less discussion about them. You know, we think, you know, I think even, you know, when I first started this work, I thought of undocumented students as being sort of this thing that's separate from the family that they grew up in, that where there may be mixed status individuals, that some were born here, some have legal status, and some do not. And that those dynamics impact achievement and they impact development. And we really don't know about the complexity of that process very well. There's virtually no data on this. And so as we move forward, I think we have to think, you know, as we move beyond DACA and as we continue the conversation about the DREAM Act, that we have to fully recognize that DACA and the DREAM Act are not going to solve the challenges that undocumented families or the children in undocumented families face. They might have legal status, that they might be able to have access to financial resources, and they might not have to worry about the things that they worry about now. But the fact that their parents or their relatives, people in their households remain without legal status will impact them in significant ways. And here you just sort of see the number of individuals that are really affected by this. I mean, it is not a small number of individuals by any means that are affected by growing up in an environment or living in a home, in a household where not everyone has legal status, and thus it creates a challenge for the entire family unit, not just one single individual. And that the challenges of one individual impact the well-being of everyone else in that family unit. And I think engaging in that conversation in that way, I hope, will get us past the conversation about just the DREAM Act and thinking more comprehensively long-term. And so the last thing I want to say is that, even for children that grow up in undocumented families, that there's this cognitive negative effect. So that, we might have solutions for the children to benefit for the DREAM Act, but for US-born children of undocumented parents, that there are negative effects on their cognitive development, which is related to their academic achievement later in school. And those negative effects, we've been able to determine them to occur as early as 24 months of age. Right? So there's very much a lot of work that remains to be done to understand how undocumented status impacts not just achievement, not just access to higher education, but also cognitive development, family functioning, the well-being of families, so that everyone in the family unit is fully able to realize their potential. And as long as one member of a family remains without legal status, everyone in that family will continue to be affected in a negative way. I'll end there, and I hope to engage with that conversation with you all. Thank you very much.
This is kind of like a weird setup of a room, but it's what we have, right? Like UCLA is going to start working on the new conference center, so we'll see how that goes. Should we start? We're all good? All right, so as it was shared earlier, my name is Carlos Amador. I wear different hats, and today I guess I'll wear the activist doing political work hat. I am part of the board of United We Dream. I'm not a founder. I started getting engaged more of the national level once the federal DREAM Act campaign was introduced in 2009, 2010. But I'm now part of the board of United We Dream, and I also do work here locally with the group Dream Team Los Angeles. Also part of the statewide alliance, California Dream Team Alliance. So, but I guess I just wanted to get maybe just kind of like do a little bit of survey. How many of you know an undocumented youth? Right, most people, right? How many of you have been moved by the undocumented youth story? Most of you, right? And so I really like where Will was taking this in regards to like the stories, right, and all that stuff. And I think one of the things that we notice, right, like as we continue, we feel that the power of the stories that we have as immigrant youth or undocumented youth is our strongest tool, our strongest weapon to try to make these changes. And I think when I like draw this, from the critical race theory field, where one of the tenets talks about storytelling and counter storytelling to make changes. And I think that's what undocumented youth really have used to advance this agenda of justice for immigrants and immigrant rights. Whereas we don't have the right to vote, right? We don't have the right to work. We don't have the right to do a lot of things, but we still have the right to speech, and we still have the right to organize. And that's how we've been able to make a lot of these changes. Thinking about Marco Antonio Farbot, who passed push forward, and champion AB 540. I graduated from high school in 2002, just a few months after AB 540 was passed. And no one really knew what AB 540 was. I remember hearing one of the staff at the high school saying, well, there is some law that allows you to go to school, so why don't you go ahead and ask that? And so since then I started getting, I was able to access higher education because of that. I really, there's been many people that have helped me get through my higher education pathway. But one of the reasons was because of AB 540. I graduated last year with my master's in social work from UCLA, and it was possible because I was able to pay in-state tuition. But since 2001, California being the second state to pass an in-state tuition law, we've seen really an explosion of undocumented student groups on campuses and off campuses, community-based organizations that have really served as a way to create the support system for undocumented youth that are just learning about what it is to be undocumented. Like all these times, all these years we've been told that we can do whatever we want, that we pledge allegiance to the flag and the path to prosperity and all that good stuff. But once we hit college and we realize that we can't work, that we can't apply for college, for driver's license, that we can't apply for scholarships and all of that stuff, it really impacts the well-being of a person. And so these groups, I really believe, started forming as a support system, right? To find other folks that, back in high school we might have not been talking about what it is to be undocumented, but now we have to, right? We have to find that support system because the university is really not supporting us. So we started seeing this explosion of undocumented student groups on campuses that after, going through the process of belonging, and finding themselves and supporting each other, they started then having the conversations of, well, we are not the only undocumented students in this city, in this state, in this nation. How can we start making more changes to continue including more undocumented students into our campuses, into the programs and stuff? I was the first undocumented student at the MSW program here at UCLA. Now we have another undocumented student, who is now doing her second year. And I know, as we continue talking and sharing our stories as master's students or master's or doctorate students in this nation, we continue finding more and more other undocumented students that are doing great work. But so I wanted to share that in regards to how we, how we see a lot of these groups coming along and moving from like a support system to an activist and advocacy type of work that is happening. And now we have, national organizations that are outspoken and totally making this, taking this to the next level. Organizations like United with Dream, which has 47 different affiliate organizations, immigrant youth organizations in 23 different states. Like the National Immigrant Youth Alliance, who has also 20 plus organizations affiliated with them. And here in California, we have the California Dream Network and the California Dream Team Alliance, which has also a great number of undocumented student groups, either on campus or on campus based. And it has been that that network that has been developing along the years, since 2001, probably a little before that, until now, 2009, where in 2009 we had the first ever, coordinated effort, national coordinated effort, where undocumented youth took it upon themselves to try to bring, the federal Dream Act up for a vote. And here, it starts a little bit of the controversy, right? Because all this time, most of the mainstream immigrant rights organizations brought a lot of the undocumented youth to testify or to speak at conferences or to speak at press events, but it was never true that the undocumented youth were actually part of the leadership body, were actually part of the decision making and the strategies and the actions and the campaigns. And it wasn't until 2009 when things started changing. United with Dream was formed in late 2008, and this campaign was lifted. And in 2009, the activism really was taken up to the next level, starting with the Trail of Dreams, starting from Miami, walking to DC, trying to bring this attention to the forefront. And then in March, for the first time, even though many undocumented youth have been publicly stating their stories, right, sharing their stories to the media, sharing their stories to spaces like this one, the first time it was like an official national day of action where undocumented youth would come out of the shadows, would come out and share their stories, borrowing this tactic from the LGBT movement and really trying to make this difference, right? And it really made a huge impact and really started creating these waves of understanding what are the plight of undocumented youth in this country. Then again, taken to the next level, to the escalation point, right, of the campaign happened, and in May 17 of 2010, the youth took it out to Senator McCain's office and sat in the office of Senator McCain and engaged in civil disobedience actions. The first time ever where undocumented youth sat in offices and voluntarily got arrested to pass this law, or to pass the federal DREAM Act. So without going too much into detail, right, like undocumented youth continue on with the civil disobedience actions and continue on with the hunger strikes and the coming out actions and stuff, and we took it up to the federal government and said, you need to pass this law, you know, for the benefit of your re-election or for the benefit of your community, you need to bring this bill to a vote. And so we brought up to a vote in September, again in December, and for the first time ever, the DREAM Act was passed through the House for the first time in history. And just a week after that, it was taken to the Senate for a vote, and unfortunately we failed to get the majority vote, 60 votes that were needed, even though we still got 55 votes. And so I think I wanted to share a little bit of that campaign, right? And I think what took after that. But I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that despite the objection from most immigrant rights organizations that a piecemeal approach was not the solution, that was not the avenue to take, you know, despite the calling of names of being divisive and being selfish and stuff, we realized that this was the only realistic option to bring forward an immigration reform in the future. And since then, right, like I think undocumented youth really asserted themselves to be leaders, not only to share their stories, but also to bring, you know, like come up with original and genuine strategies on how to make changes. And I think all now the news and the stuff that we're seeing now and the change of dialogue, right? Even candidate Romney saying that he might not, you know, repeal the deferred action policy, right? When just a few months ago he was saying that he was going to veto the DREAM Act and make everyone to self-deport. We're definitely changing this language. We're definitely changing the dialogue of immigrant rights. And you know, like after 2010, we took it out to the states and fought against Russell Pierce and took him out of office, right? It was undocumented youth, Latino youth walking the streets, canvassing the streets, making sure that people turned out to vote. You know, it was undocumented youth that passed the Maryland DREAM Act, and now also undocumented youth that passed the California DREAM Act, becoming the third state giving financial aid for undocumented youth in the country. And so, you know, but we were also thinking like, well, what's going to be the proactive strategy at the national level, you know, and I think I'll let Nady expand on that, you know, but I really wanted to emphasize how the fact that we were able to, you know, that people in the past were able to pass laws that allowed undocumented youth, you know, an oppressed group of individuals to access higher education, really allowed a space for undocumented youth to become politicized, to understand what their identity was, and to be able to take it upon themselves to bring those changes. And so I just wanted to make that specific comment. Right now, when we're seeing deferred action happening, and hopefully in the future, a more permanent solution, whether it's DREAM Act or others, we understand how access to higher education, just getting educated, you know, and being empowered, you know, by ourselves, has allowed to make those changes, and we will continue moving forward. There's thousands of undocumented youth that for the first time ever, they're coming out saying that they are undocumented. They're coming out and applying for deferred action, and there's a huge opportunity for us to organize and to continue pushing the agenda forward for immigrant rights in this country. Thank you.
I'm a little bit shorter.
Well, I just first wanted to say thank you to UCLA and the planning committee for inviting us and really making this panel as diverse and really complex to really have a good conversation about these issues. I'm really gonna just, listening to Carlos is just like a reminder of how all of us have been able to get our degrees, what has happened in the last 20 years and how we've been able to be part of that path. So, I graduated from UC Santa Cruz in 2008. I'm still undocumented, and since came home, I grew up in Pasadena and pretty suburban. I will never claim I'm from Los Angeles because whoever is from Los Angeles will tell me otherwise. And so it was a different reality for me but my mother was an organizer, so I was very much politicized when I was very young. So, all of us have our own stories, and I think that really gives context to who we are. I wanted to just really focus for purposes of this panel about our work as undocumented youth in the years 2011 leading to 2012, the announcement on June 15th. And Carlos really covered 2010 and our fight, the decade-long fight for the Federal Dream Act, and still the fight. But in 2011, with the support of great mentors like Tom Sines from Maldiv, we really gave ourselves sort of the opportunity to be creative and be bold about what we wanted to do. We had seen what happened in 2010 and saw how much progress we were able to do when we said, no, we're gonna do it ourselves. But we also saw how much repression from all angles we were also getting. So we had to come forward with our own strategy and be ready to deal with all of it at the same time. And that's what we did. We got creative. We started thinking, okay, well, we have great partners and a lot of people in the community that are fighting these our fights inside the courts, like Maldiv. We have great people like Marco Fireball and more legislators that have stand up in solidarity with youth and undocumented youth for different bills that were pro-immigrant. And we were fighting along the way the whole time, but we've never thought about the executive branch. Okay, so there's the president, Barack Obama, that claims to be very much pro-dreamers and believes in this idea of living the American dream. And so we kept on asking ourselves, then why have we not had any progress nationally for pro-immigrant policies? And so we said, you know what, we're not going to give him a way out of this. We're going to make it all about him and how he can make this. And his slogan in 2011, leading up to 2012 for the election, was we can't wait, right? So we said, well, we can't wait either. So let's do something. And we really, from the very beginning, April, March, we started a public education campaign, doing webinars, doing what we're doing right here with all of you, but with undocumented youth across the nation, teaching ourselves about how the government worked through the executive branch, how have administrative decisions have been made in the past that gave relief to widows of U.S. citizens, that passed away while their petition was happening, or for how deferred action and other policies have been used before for smaller groups of people to keep them here in the country with lawful status. And we started doing the research, and we had great partners that said, yes, guys, go all the way. And we had to learn the law, right? We had been the students in the classrooms, we had been the people getting arrested on the streets, we had been those in law school that still undocumented were making their way. But with this time, we really had to read the books and do the research, and we did it. We did it, and we came with a really good proposal. Why not grant administrative relief to all undocumented youth that are DREAM Act eligible? And at the beginning, they immediately said no. The president has no power to make an executive order to grant relief to a large number of people. And we said, yes, you can. We have the legal research to back it up. We have great allies in this that have been doing this for years. And not only that, but then we got a letter from 100 different law professors, including led by Professor Hiroshi here at the UCLA School of Law, that said no. In fact, President Obama, you have all authority to do an administrative action here and grant relief to all these undocumented youth that meets a certain criteria. And you can create the criteria yourself, by the way. You can figure out however you want to do that. And that's exactly what we did. We were the people. Dreamers really have, and undocumented youth have really led the way in the legal research and proposing a solution and being creative about it. We developed our own strategies and we implemented them all the way from being our own negotiators with the White House about this policy to doing the actions inside the Obama administration offices. And the beauty I feel about our movement is that even when there has to be disagreement to create tension, to create movement, it's how things work in this world. I mean, I'm a true believer in balance, and you have to have both. And the beauty of our movement, I really think, is that we have such a diverse group of people that believe in so many different strategies that there's just no way of stopping us. That even though there's just, some of us that might do certain kind of work here in Los Angeles, but some other groups that might do it in North Carolina or Arizona, and they're all doing something that is adding to the fight, but they're gonna do it regardless. They're doing it because they have felt empowered to do it. And that's what we have seen, the empowerment of undocumented youth to take a stand and take leadership and move forward. And we were able to push enough the administration to have this conversation with the White House to finally, in May, have a meeting with the council of the White House, and where we literally argued our legal analysis about how this could be done. And at the end of the meeting, we said, oh, and by the way, we just heard La Opinión just published this letter that 100 professors just signed saying you can't do it. This was all part of strategies of using different things like media and direct action, and this is what we've all learned throughout the years. And we gave them a deadline. We said, if by June 12th we don't hear from you about what are you gonna do to deliver this to the undocumented youth movement, we will target places like Nevada, North Carolina, all the swing states. And again, the beauty of our movement was that even though we in our head were like, we're gonna have to organize all these guys, actually people were ready to go all on themselves. And even before June 12th, June 10th, all the different actions started happening across different states inside the Obama offices, just like we had imagined it. And it just organically happened. And it was a great moment because as much as the White House kept on telling us, we are the White House staff. We are not the Obama election staff or the Obama campaign staff. It's all connected, and we understood that. We've developed all those analytical skills and are so politically engaged now that we know the game. And so we delivered, and on June 15th, not by coincidence, we chose June 15th, the anniversary of Playa versus Doe, to say, even though we were already hearing rumors that they were gonna make the announcement, we said, well, we should still do our action outside the UCLA office in LA, and we should just still block the street. And we still did it because we didn't believe that they were gonna do it. And after that action, all of us at the Labor Center were sitting there listening to Obama give a speech. And what I wanted to draw and end my whole thing was when he was giving the speech about the deferred action policy, his reason was this was the right thing to do. Now, if he believes that, I can come up with so many other reasons that he should have done much more. But the fact that he used that as the reason and not use it as a other way to do some more harm on the border was important for us, because it places us in a different angle to push for whatever we want to push in the future. And that's really what we want to do, is to push the immigrant rights movement to think outside of the box and to think from another perspective, to think that we can push policy without compromising and hurting our brothers and sisters on the border, but we can do it maybe little by little and doing it using smarter strategies. And lastly, I just wanted to share that the pieces of our campaign that really were the platform of the deferred action was the right to live our lives without fear, the right to move freely. That included their driver's licenses. And I think since this is a space about thinking about the legal and the intersection of organizing and legal strategies, we have a true concern that because we have so many states now taking very affirmative decisions on whether or not they're going to grant driver's licenses to youth that are beneficiaries of DACA, that now nationally that's going to be the debate, right? Whether a state should decide on their own. Whereas from the very beginning, from our own legal research and what we were proposing forward, we were very clear about how this was going to grant us driver's licenses from the very beginning. And so it's concerning to us, and now we have to engage in this national debate whether a state is going to have to decide that one by one. But these are parts, the complexities of it all, and we're ready to take on the challenges. Thank you.
came out better than we could have imagined when we were sitting around thinking about this. We wanted to have a legal discussion, and Victor, your conversation was a great way of framing where the anti-immigration laws have been and where the fights against them have been centered, and then moving to Will Perez's discussion from the education and psychological vantage point was a terrific way to give us an overview of some of the larger trends and issues that we need to be thinking about. And then how inspiring to hear from Carlos and Nelly about their activism and their, it's just a great inspirational story. And I don't know, as Dean Moran, I say we should just admit them now, right, to law school and the entire organization. And I look forward to having you and other dreamer activists in my classes for many years to come. I'm going to take the prerogative, I think we'll have about 20 minutes now of Q&A, but I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question, which I'd like actually each of the panelists to address. And it really is just continuing with the themes, but just to make transparent what we've been talking about over these last 4 speakers. The question is this: how do we institutionalize, meaning how do we put in place institutional mechanisms, organizations, ties, avenues for linking the moves that would get us from what's happening in the courts, which is almost always defensive, right? We're almost always having to respond to what reactionaries are doing in the state capitals, right? To getting us to the offensive political strategies, you know, organizing strategies and political strategies in all the varieties that they would take. And you guys gave a great kind of catalog of the different ways that could happen. But I'd like each of you to address that question of what are the mechanisms by which we could institutionalize this, because this is just part of a larger civil rights movement that is ongoing, right? And is going to have many sort of, we're as you guys suggested, all of these remarks suggest we have a long way to go. And so how can we institutionalize those? Are there any strategies that you've seen, that you've already seen nascent perhaps, or maybe already institutionalized? But I just want people to address that question, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So whoever would like to start.
I guess, well...
And there's a mic there, so if you can just share the mic.
You know, I don't know much about, political strategy or the laws. As a social scientist, what I'm going to respond to it by talking about implementing this at an institutional level. Instituting support for youth and for young adults who come to institutions of education, whether it's higher education or K-12. I mean, I think, one of the things that I particularly pay attention to is whether we're doing similar kinds of efforts at the various levels that we need to work on this issue. I mean, clearly we have very competent people doing work at the legal level with MALDEF. Clearly we have very competent people doing work at the organizing activist, level. And we're doing some very good work at the level of higher education and institution and educational settings. I think more so we have good work and research on effective practices in higher education than we have in K-12. I mean, the fact is that there's a pipeline issue, as was mentioned in the opening remarks here, and there's just great leaks in the pipeline. And so we need to do better efforts to find out what works to get undocumented youth or children who come from undocumented families on the path to higher education and on the path to educational success. How do we get undocumented English language learners, right, who for many reasons may not get the resources that they need, may not get the information that they need to be redesignated into curriculum, into the track that's going to put them on the path to college. I think we need to pay a lot of attention at that level, and we also, in higher education, we need to do the same thing. So there's a lot of work that has been done already, and I think disseminating those best practices is a key part of, all these efforts.
I think that one of the ways that we can institutionalize this is by kind of what I was saying earlier in my remarks was that undocumented youth have had to create their own spaces and their own campaigns because they weren't listened by the adults. And so I think one way to institutionalize it is hire those undocumented youth. Right? One of the excuses was, well, we can't hire them because they can't work legally. So now there's DACA, now you're going to be able to hire them. The other thing would be ask foundations to give money to undocumented youth groups. We ran the Right to Dream campaign that led us to the deferred action policy with no money whatsoever. Here and there, an organization will pay for our flight to DC or pay for the printing of the posters and stuff, but we didn't have a budget at all. So if you see that these strategies are working, why don't you pull your contacts of foundations and tell them these youth are doing great work, send some checks their way. So, and then just finally, just including undocumented youth in the conversations, right? Including them in the task force or the steering committees of your organization to try to come up with the strategies. And then, I guess finally, for those undocumented youth that are new to this issue, right, that are new to this movement, obviously they might not have the experience or level of strategizing, right? So creating training programs, leadership development programs for them. So I think Tom, I don't know if he's in the room, but Maldef has been doing an amazing job at supporting undocumented youth, lifting their voices and creating those spaces for them. So, hi Tom.
I get that.
Well, I think that right now we saw an onslaught of anti-immigrant legislation, but we also see some glimmers of hope. And in California, notwithstanding what happened with the Trust Act, we have the opportunity to create a sort of petri dish and a sort of example for the rest of the country and put things in place like AB 540. I remember back when I was a young attorney, I wrote pieces of some of the legal memorandums to show why it was legal. And when we're in that situation and we're defending a good piece of legislation, it's far more fun, far more uplifting to do that kind of work because you feel like you're pushing the agenda forward rather than playing defense, defense, defense. Not only that, you put the resources of the other side spent on playing defense, 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 rather than thinking of more ways to attack the immigrant community. On top of that, we also have all the traditional mechanisms.
Victor, can you just hold the mic closer because people in the back are having trouble?
On top of that, I think we've got all the traditional mechanisms that we have as lawyers in litigation to sort of root out the discriminatory factors that are keeping undocumented youth and Latino youth generally from succeeding in schools, whether it's not being designated as gifted and talented when they should be, whether it's being told that they're not being allowed to go to a certain university because their test score is high enough, when universities are over-relying on factors that are going to create a discriminatory effect on Latinos. Those are the things that, as we get beyond this series of anti-immigrant legislation and move to the next step, we've got to look at opening up pathways right now when they're closed, because we know not only the wonderful story of the Dreamers is wonderful, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. There are whole groups of talented youth out there that right now are being frozen out of the educational system, that aren't given a fair chance. And I think that's where we need to put our energies going forward, to start to tap into that larger potential that right now we're losing out on.
I think, I agree with everything has been said. I think for the little piece of extra that I can bring in is that what has been really interesting to me to recognize in the last 2 years, seeing all this anti-immigrant legislation roll down and how escalated they've been about that, like the radical conservatives has been that is really, we really have to engage in this fight being very conscious that it's an ideological battle, that, that is not just at the legislative or in our schools, but really like people truly believe, people that look like many of us in the room shouldn't be in places where we are right now. And that we can't forget, because what we have seen is all the arguments that they're making in all these laws are all about their ideology. They're all about dehumanizing and criminalizing immigrants in this country. So when we engage in that fight, it's really all about humanizing the issue and realizing that to change the paradigm, we have to engage in the battle, being conscious that we're really changing people's minds and hearts. And so I think all of us in this room have an opportunity to do that at many different levels. I think that in my experience as an undergrad and in high school, you know, being an activist was part of my experience. And the fact that that was part of my experience really, I feel, was the training wheels to the work that I do now and I hope to do in the future. So when you get a chance to support and really nurture an undocumented youth that is having a hard time maybe balancing out schoolwork with their activism, that don't give them a choice to choose one over the other, but understand that their reality, they have to do both. And honestly, when they do both, then they'll come out being ready to fight for the whole thing, for everyone. So, you know, I just wanted to add those two things.
Terrific, terrific. Let's have like now 3 questions from the audience, and then after we get the 3, we'll let some of the panelists respond. And if you could just be brief in your question, but also tell us who you are. Yes.
Lupe Anguiano from Oxnard. I was just wondering for Victor, you know, Maldev, if we have developed a framework for comprehensive immigration. You know, November 6th is coming up, and after that we really need to move forward with whoever is elected.
Great, so let's take 2 more, and then we'll, yes.
Melanie Cervantes. I'm a program officer for a family foundation. I'm also a political artist. I was in Arizona last week. I've been partnering with grassroots organizations there. And while it's exciting that you know, the parts of SB 1070, you know, that had the injunction, the reality on the ground is quite different. Like, I heard a man testify about being pulled over who was a resident. He didn't have his papers on him. He called home hoping his daughter would bring them to him. His wife brought them to him, who happened to be undocumented. She was stopped. The Tucson Police Department was able to like keep them there long enough so they could call ICE or Border Patrol. And she ended up being taken in. She's in Eloy Detention Center. So like on the ground, the reality is that, you know, the practices and the culture of harassment and the fear makes it so that people aren't even leaving their homes. So I'm wondering if folks could address kind of the realities kind of outside of like the litigation strategy and how the stories are being collected about these, you know, that's in violation of, you know, what's on the books, but also what additional strategies folks are taking on, because that's not a unique story. Like, we were working in Tucson and Phoenix, and everywhere we went, we heard slightly different versions of stories like this, including very violent acts by any of the departments of enforcement, whether it's local police, Border Patrol, ICE. It's just egregious and happening a lot. So I was hoping folks could address that.
Thank you. Is there one more question that somebody wants to put on the table? Okay, yeah.
I've been thinking.
Sorry, it's right up here in front.
I've been thinking about this since the last panel. My name is Milo Egipciaco. And I should have perhaps addressed it to the last panel, but it connects with the litigation aspect of this panel. And that is that a while ago in the 60s and 70s, Thomas Sass wrote a book on the myth of mental illness. One of the things that he mentioned in his book was the fact that there was a great disagreement between psychiatrists in labeling people. And I connected that to, well, they were talking about the English learners and the labels of emotional distress or emotional disability. I wonder if there has been any litigation in terms of misdiagnosis, and if not, why is it that there hasn't been? Because there's a pathway there to simply put this in the courts against the misdiagnosis of immigrants, the misdiagnosis of language learners in our system, you know? And so that's what I want.
Could everybody in the audience hear the questions, or should I recap the questions? Okay, so there were 3 questions. The first was by Doña Lupe, and it was asking what the plans are, I didn't get your last name, from MALDEF in particular in terms of achieving comprehensive immigration reform. I'm going to assign that one to Victor. The second was from Melanie Cervantes, and it was, I would encapsulate it as being a question about the gap between the law in action and the law on the books. So the law on the books might say, yeah, there's been injunctions and this is not supposed to be enforced, but what Melanie's saying is what she's seeing is extreme and continuing violence in everyday encounters between the police and Border Patrol and ICE officials, in particular in Arizona. And then, Milo, your question was, the third question was about, and I think, Will, this is directed at you. Maybe we'll do that. So Victor, you're going to take the first question. Will, you're going to take this third one, and Nelly and Carlos, you can address the second question. So the third question was about whether, sort of linking the last panel to this panel, and whether there aren't any ways to think about litigation, but I think there's also a psychological dimension to that, Will, so I'll have you address that one. So why don't we go in that order, answering the first, second, and third. And then I see our speaker, our next speaker in the audience, so we'll wrap up after this.
I want to address comprehensive immigration reform. I think there's no shortage of good ideas that have been proposed that are essential to a comprehensive immigration reform package. We've proposed one in the last cycle. We're prepared to address this issue again after the election, regardless of the outcome. And the key piece of any kind of comprehensive immigration reform is to address the large swaths of people who are in this country, living in this country every day, and who are not given some kind of permanent status or some pathway to permanent status. And the Dreamer discussion is a piece of that, but there's it's a far larger discussion that addresses newborns and goes all the way up to grandparents, and making sure that all of these people who call the United States their home have an opportunity to be recognized by this country as having some kind of permanent presence here. And I think that is the core of what we're proposing, the core of what we think is essential in any kind of comprehensive immigration reform. And we're prepared to take it up again. As is no secret in this room, we took it up last cycle and weren't able to get it through. But a new day is a new opportunity, and we're prepared to take that on again.
I just wanted to add one thing to Victor's answer about that. That I think in that bigger question, I think the one first thing that I think all of us are thinking about, the folks that do immigrant rights, is like making sure we don't repeat the same mistakes that we've repeated in the past about movie legislation that brought, and also what we put to the table. So maybe re-looking at the 2007 version and thinking bigger and better. But then lastly, the how, I think it's really where the question is. So I think the intention should never be questioned from no side at all about what we want for our communities, no matter who it's coming from. Even for us, when we've been called selfish and not thinking about our parents, I think the intention is to continue to do that. The how we're going to do that, the strategy, is where I feel we really have to spend a lot of time thinking what would be the best way. And the second question about what's happening in underground in Arizona, you know, we have a lot of our colleagues that do a lot of activism, the Arizona Dream Act Coalition out there, and other organizations like Puente have engaged in like neighborhood watch groups where they are trying to figure out ways of better documenting these stories, but also having like a rapid response team when people get caught up in those situations. And obviously to the magnitude of how that's helping people, there's just, you know, I wouldn't be able to tell you, I don't live there, but I think it is important to highlight that, yeah, like the violations are still happening, and the education, like I said earlier, is so key, and the empowerment is so key, so that people can advocate for themselves, because there's just no way we're going to have lawyers around all the time. So we have to learn how to defend ourselves.
So Carlos and Will, you can each just take 2 minutes to wrap up. That'd be great.
I'll just be brief in regards to the question of the Arizona and what's happening on the ground. I would just add, like, there's folks that are coming, like that are doing great work on trying to change the politics and change the politicians in that state, including Sheriff Joe Arpaio and trying to vote him out of office. I know last weekend there was a delegation that went from Southern California to Arizona to try to register voters. So I mean, the reality is that people continue being discriminated, and people do realize that in the different groups that we're connected with, and they're trying to do something about it.
Very quickly, in terms of labeling, and particularly the label of English language learner, I do want to say that there is clear empirical evidence that labeling has an impact on the way and the expectations that we have of students. Right? And so, I mean, it is not, I mean, I can tell you a whole story why ESL was changed to ELD. I mean, part of it in why students don't want to be labeled that. I mean, I think, and perhaps that's not a coincidence that, as Professor Tandara articulated, that we have to worry about the quality of instruction that happens. Maybe, in addition to whether we're using the right tools to identify language learners or not, but I would argue, based on the empirical work on low expectations and how that's related to achievement, that perhaps it's not an accident that, the instruction for English language learners is of poor quality. Perhaps that is related to the low expectations of English language learners. And we know that low-income kids and English language learners, that those challenges have an impact, a direct impact, a measurable impact on achievement. But we also know that low expectations have a measurable impact on achievement. Now, whether that is merits for a lawsuit, I'll let my lawyer, colleagues here answer that. But I would argue that, that we should not provide a subpar education to kids that we label as being less capable, or that we equate label of English language learner as being less capable. And and I have plenty of anecdotes about the things that I've heard when I visited classrooms. So I think there's certainly merit to labels and access in the role of law in that process.
Please join me in thanking our panel.